Oh, yeah, Sandy, before I get to the Nick calls and calls on whatever you want, Sandy Alderson today, let's listen.
Sandy, you talked last time about how sometimes you think you might be too cautious with injuries. Given Jay's, a couple months now he's been battling the various injuries, and Struble playing through some pain. Do you reconsider that approach with those two guys in particular?
Jay Bruce, you referred to?
And then Struble kind of seems like Struble's been playing through something for a few weeks now.
Yeah, I mean, Struble has managed the problems that he's experienced and done a nice job for us. And I think he's an example of how sometimes one can manage an injury and continue to play. In Jay's case, really the injury has not been apparent for that long. So it really hasn't been about playing him through injury. It's really about playing and then looking at the possibility that there may be something there that's impairing him on the field. So, I wouldn't put those two in the same category.
Tyler, then back left.
Sandy, with some of the issues that have been going on with your over 30 kind of players in there, has that caused you at all to reevaluate your, I guess, investment in those kind of guys going forward?
It's a good question. I think as an industry, investment in older players is diminishing. On the other hand, older players can present a real value and from a performance standpoint, improve the team. But at the same time, I think you have to recognize that, with age comes some additional challenges physically. And what we have to do is, more importantly than anything else, figure out a way to address those issues as they arise or before they arise. So, for example, one of the things we've talked about is an approach within our performance department that puts particular emphasis on that type of player from a preventative standpoint, from a management standpoint. In other words, recognizing, the increased probability or possibility of injury and addressing it in terms of how we allocate our resources among all our players, young, old, regulars, bench players, etc.
Mike on the left.
Sandy, realistically, I'm over here.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Okay,
realistically, are you still playing for this season? And as an aside, how much interest are you receiving in some of your players?
Well, look, we need some more wins. We're 10 games under 500, and we need to see some improvement in our one-loss record almost immediately. So I think we all recognize that. At the same time, we're still in the middle of June, and most teams are still trying to sort out where they are and what they're going to do, and a lot will depend on what happens over the next 2 or 3 weeks. So we have had conversations with teams, but nothing that I would call, substantive, and really just getting a sense of what direction they think they're headed. And the fact is, there are a lot of teams that clearly, there are a few teams that are going to be buyers. There are a few teams that are already sellers, and there are a bunch of teams in the middle. And I would put us in the middle.
And DeGrom and Syndergaard, are they possibilities to be traded?
Look, we know what we have in Jacob and DeGrom and Syndergaard. I don't know that any team will ever tell you that they're never going to do this and they're never going to do that. If somebody came to us and said, we'll give you all of our top 20 prospects, it's probably something you'd have to at least consider. But we know what we have in those two pitchers.
Pete on the right.
Hey, Sandy,
Yeah.
when you consider the chronic issue with Yoenis Cespedes and what you have as part of this core right now, can you readily see with the players you have under contract next year, with what's coming up through the minors and what you might be able to do this offseason, this team being in a position to compete for a championship as soon as next year?
Well, I said that at the beginning of this year and felt it. And, our job every year is to put our team in a position to be competitive the following year, whether that's starting at the trade deadline or starting in the off season. And that certainly would be our goal. And I think the answer is yes. There are a lot of things that have happened this year, and nobody can assume that everything's going to go right. But from my standpoint, absolutely.
And talking about some of the older players that have been banged up over the course of this year, there are teams like the Nationals and the Dodgers have had a lot of injuries this year as well. And in the Nationals' case, they have Mark Reynolds, the call-upper, Jeremy Hellickson. Why, when the minors aren't full of prospects ready to help out at the major league level, aren't there more veteran guys that could fill in and give you a couple of weeks when needed over the course of a year?
Well, we've added Mesoraco. We added Batista. Both of them, I think, have been pluses. We just added Kazmarski to the roster, not a veteran guy. Kazmarski was out most of the year with an injury, so he's only really started playing over the last month or so. Bryce Brentz is another guy that we had at the minor league level. So we've had a variety of people at the minor league level, not of the notoriety of Batista or Mesoraco, what have you, but who've been available to us, but are injured. Cicchini, injured foot. Cicchini's been here before. So, there's some other things that have gone on as well. And one of the benefits of what we've seen so far is an example of, say, Dom Smith in left field. And I know everybody looks at that and says, well, that's a sign of weakness within the organization. I view it as a positive. Not that it wasn't done out of necessity, but here's a guy who can play more than one position. We've got a right-handed hitter. We've just moved to AAA, who's probably not able to move off of first base. If we're able to find another spot for a guy like Dom Smith, and he continues to swing the bat the way he has, that's a plus for us. Now, is that something we'd like to do in the middle of a pennant race? Not necessarily, but I do think there's some positives that have come out of it so far, and we'll see how far it goes.
Steve?
Sandy, back to the possibility of trading a guy like Jacob deGrom or Noah Syndergaard. You've had over the last few days some guys come out pretty strongly against that publicly in the clubhouse, whether it's Dave Eiland, Mickey Callaway, Todd Frazier yesterday talking about how against rebuilds he is. Does that have any impact on the organization's thinking at all, especially with a guy like Callaway, who part of the reason you brought him in here was to have that two-way conversation that you talked a lot about?
I think the short answer is yes. Again, I don't think that player opinion or fan opinion controls our decision making, but I think you have to factor it in. I think we do factor it in. Doesn't mean that we always come out consistent with how those opinions have been expressed, but to say that they're not a factor, I think would be to sort of ignore the obvious.
Laura in the front.
You had a few options for how you were going to make room on the 40-man roster for the two new guys. What made you decide to designate Hansel Robles for assignment?
Well, Hansel's been with us quite a while. We've seen him pitch well. We've seen him pitch less well. We've got a number of other young relievers, some of whom we acquired last year at the trade deadline, we want to take a look at. Tim Peterson is an example of somebody that has gotten an opportunity and, at least in the short term, pitched well for us. So, we just felt it was time to take a look at a couple of additional people, and we're excited to see what Drew Smith can do for us.
Tyler?
Sandy, you talked a couple minutes ago about knowing what you have in deGrom and Syndergaard. But it's been a month now since Syndergaard's pitched. He barely pitched last year. do you worry about things tending to linger for him and what you really do have in him because he doesn't pitch that much?
Well, you certainly have to consider that, Tyler. There's no question that he hasn't been able to pitch consistently over the last couple of years. On the other hand, I know how we view him, and where he will be once we get him back, and I know how the rest of baseball views him. So, for those two reasons, again, I just say, hey, we know what we have, and at the same time, you never say never.
Mike on the right.
Sandy, this is picking on Tyler's first question about investment in players above 30. Several of those were multi-year investments. How does that affect you, or does it hinder you a little bit in terms of flexibility as you start to look forward, specific positions and
Right.
where you can improve?
Well, I think, first of all, let's go back to we talk about multi-year contracts. Most of those contracts, if not all of them, are, to the extent they're multi-year, they're 2-year contracts, not longer. Secondly, let's be careful about writing off, players because they're 30 years old or they haven't performed well over the first couple of months of the season. So we certainly are not. And, I think you got to be careful about making judgments over relatively short periods of time. Now, is 2.5 months a short period of time? From a baseball standpoint, certainly can be, yes. So, what's interesting to me here is I haven't heard a question yet about Jose Reyes. And, a couple of weeks ago, everybody was up in arms about, what his future was and was he being protected, et cetera, et cetera. He has value to us. He's demonstrated that over the last week or 10 days or so. Mickey committed to playing him a little bit more, and we're seeing what he's still capable of doing. So, you really do have to be careful about making judgments about players in I wouldn't say a short period of time, but a limited period of time from a baseball standpoint.
All right, that's Sandy Alderson, even with a word or two about Reyes. And Reyes had the bunt before the big comeback home runs. He did play a game the other night and get on base 3 times in the game. He walked twice. He played shortstop and got a single and a walk twice in the game. So he has, with a little more activity, played a little better. So you heard Sandy saying he's staying. Bottom line is, he told you what you already knew, and that was that most likely 9 times out of 10, Syndergaard's going nowhere. And he basically said if someone wanted to trade their whole roster to us, we might look at DeGrom. So I guess you got the idea that DeGrom's not going anywhere, which we've been telling you from day one. What the Mets have always told us is that DeGrom was not going anywhere. So they never put Syndergaard on that list with DeGrom, but DeGrom was put there very strongly that he was going nowhere. Syndergaard, unlikely, but never put where DeGrom was put. 5 o'clock, here's the Mink Man.